Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This is where we take those really complex, sometimes pretty dense sources, and we boil them down. We get to the essential knowledge you actually need to feel properly informed.
That's the goal.
And today, wow, we've got quite a stack here. We're diving into a pile of expert financial analysis, all focused on, well, let's be honest, one of the biggest threats out there that maybe doesn't get enough headline space, the U.S. national debt. And it's accelerating fast.
Yeah. Accelerating is the right word. This isn't just some abstract number. We're really talking about genuine systemic risk here. And just to be clear up front, our goal today is purely analytical.
Right.
We're not here to debate, should we cut taxes, should we cut spending? That's the whole political logjam in Washington.
Exactly. We see that play out constantly.
Our mission today is different. We want to explore what the analysis says are the, frankly, unavoidable consequences.
Yeah.
The dramatic, maybe even catastrophic outcomes if Congress doesn't act, if this debt just keeps climbing on this, well, exponential path it's on.
We're looking for that tipping point, that invisible dog fence the source material talks about.
Precisely. The moment the system just can't take it anymore.
And just to really hammer home how serious this is, one of the reports we looked at uses this analogy that it stopped me in my tracks.
Which one was that?
It describes the U.S. fiscal situation as, and I'm quoting here, a 350-pound, 2-pack-a-day smoker on the ICU table.
Wow. Yeah. That's vivid.
And this isn't coming from some fringe blogger, right? This is the kind of language serious economic thinkers are using now. It signals a system in, well, dire straits, immediate crisis territory.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And that kind of language, it's designed to shock you out of complacency. Because let's face it, when we talk about trillions of dollars,
the number just washes over you. It's too big.
Exactly. It loses all meaning. But that metaphor, the smoker in the ICU, that brings it right down to a personal level. You understand that kind of instability.
Right.
Life-threatening.
Right.
So yeah, we need to figure out what happens if we actually trip that wire, that invisible fence. The point where the markets just decide, you know what? The U.S. isn't the safe bet anymore.
Okay, so let's start there, defining the threat. What is the situation right now? How much are we actually borrowing?
Well, the core fact, and it's a historical one, is that America's total borrowing, the national debt, is now basically the same size as our entire economy.
The whole GDP.
Yep. The debt-to-GDP ratio is hovering right around 100%. Now, to give you some context.
Because we've been here before, haven't we?
We have. The last time the U.S. hit this kind of level was right after World War II.
Yeah.
Huge spending, obviously. But here's the crucial difference.
Okay.
Back then, after the war, everyone expected massive economic growth. GDP was set to boom, and interest rates were kept really low. So the idea was growth would shrink that debt relative to the economy pretty quickly.
And it did, largely.
It did. But today, we're hitting that 100% ratio before we even fully account for the wave of future spending on things like Social Security and Medicare. And every credible forecast, I mean every one, shows this number is just set to skyrocket.
You're living by.
Mandatory spending, those entitlements, and, crucially, the rising cost of interest payments on the debt we already have.
So it's not just the size of the debt, it's that we don't have that post-war growth engine ready to bail us out this time, and the interest costs are adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly. That's the bind we're in.
So politically, this is paralyzing. How did we dig this hole? The sources actually gave a really interesting kind of rough breakdown, looking back to, the early 90s when we briefly had a surplus?
Yeah, it's a useful simplification, but it helps. It basically breaks down into 3 parts, roughly equal thirds.
Okay, what are they?
So about 1/3 of the increase in this fiscal hole, let's call it, comes from various tax cuts that have been enacted over the last few decades. Another third roughly comes from spending increases, both mandatory spending, like entitlements, and discretionary spending, the stuff Congress votes on each year.
Okay, so tax cuts, spending increases, what's the last third?
Emergencies. Big, unexpected costs. Think about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, very expensive. The huge government response needed after the 2008 financial crisis. And then, of course, the massive spending during the COVID-19 pandemic.
That breakdown feels really important because, borrowing for a genuine emergency, like keeping the economy afloat during COVID, you could argue that was necessary, maybe unavoidable.
Absolutely. Some of that emergency spending falls into a different category. But
the other 2/3, that's different. That's policy choices. Tax cuts without matching spending cuts, or spending hikes without finding the revenue. That's the chronic condition. That's what put the smoker in the ICU, maybe.
That's a very good way to put it. That chronic part is what leads us directly to this concept the source is called the debt spiral.
Okay, define that for us. Debt spiral. Sounds bad.
It is bad. It revolves around a really fundamental economic concept. Supply and demand. In this case, the supply and demand for U.S. government debt. Treasuries.
Right.
The core idea of the spiral is that we're simply issuing too much debt. The supply is overwhelming what the market can comfortably absorb without demanding higher interest rates in return.
And the source material brought in Ray Dalio's perspective here. Founder of Bridgewater, legendary investor, studies these big historical cycles.
Yeah, Dalio has been sounding the alarm on U.S. debt since, well, at least 2008. But he's much more concerned now. He describes the current situation using another medical analogy, actually. He calls it a severe circulatory system condition.
Okay, what does he mean by that? The circulatory system, like blood flow?
Sort of. Think about it this way. The U.S. government runs a huge deficit every year. It spends way more than it takes in. To cover that difference, it has to constantly sell new debt, new treasury bonds. Dalio's point is that the sheer volume of new debt we need to sell each year, just to pay the bills and roll over old debt, is now greater than the demand from investors globally.
So supply is outstripping demand.
Exactly. It's like trying to sell more apples than people want to buy. What happens? The price has to fall. Or in the bond market's case, the interest rate the government has to pay has to go up to attract buyers.
And the circulatory system part.
That refers to the plumbing of the financial system. The big banks, the primary dealers, they're obligated to buy this debt at auction. But if they can't easily resell it to other investors because demand is weak, the whole system gets clogged up. Stress.
Like high blood pressure in the financial system.
That's a perfect analogy. And it forces those dealers, and ultimately all investors, to demand a higher return, a higher interest rate for taking on that risk.
And this whole situation leads Dalio to a pretty shocking prediction about the near future.
Yeah, this is the part that really gets your attention. Based on his analysis, he believes that if this debt trajectory isn't corrected, there's, and this is his number, more than a 50% chance the U.S. will experience a trauma in the next 3 to 5 years.
Trauma. He doesn't just say recession, he says trauma. What does that imply?
It implies something much sharper, more sudden, more destabilizing than just a normal economic downturn. It suggests a shock, maybe a sudden loss of confidence in the markets, leading to interest rates spiking dramatically, or a crisis in simply being able to refinance the existing debt smoothly. It's a systemic event he's warning about.
Okay, that sounds like a huge problem for the U.S. But you mentioned earlier this isn't just an American issue, it's a global threat. How does our debt problem ripple outwards?
It ripples out mainly because of the role of the U.S. dollar. It's still the world's dominant reserve currency. Most international trade, commodities like oil, they're priced in dollars. Central banks around the world hold massive amounts of dollars and U.S. treasuries as reserves.
So the dollar is foundational.
Absolutely. So when the U.S. struggles with its debt, it has two big global impacts. First, if the U.S. resorts to, let's say, printing money to manage the debt, that leads to inflation here.
Right.
That inflation erodes the value of the dollar everywhere. So every country, every company, every bank holding dollars or dollar-denominated assets, they effectively take a haircut. Their purchasing power drops.
Okay, so inflation is one global impact. What's the second?
Geopolitical vulnerability. If the U.S. is seen as fiscally weak, unreliable, maybe unstable, that shakes confidence in the entire global financial system that's built on the dollar, and U.S. Treasury bonds being the ultimate safe assets.
It creates uncertainty everywhere. Right?
Exactly. And it gives rivals an opening, potentially.
Right.
But fundamentally, every country holding U.S. assets gets dragged into our debt issues, whether they like it or not. Their own financial stability becomes partly dependent on ours.
Okay, let's dig into that mechanism a bit more. You said the government funds its deficit by issuing and selling treasuries, government bonds. People lend the U.S. money, expect interest back. Simple enough.
On the surface, yeah. It's the bedrock of global finance, really.
But what happens when those lenders, those investors buying the bonds, start getting nervous? You mentioned this earlier, the bond vigilantes.
Right. The bond vigilantes. It's a great name, isn't it? It sounds like some shadowy group, but it's not.
Huh. Yeah. So who are they, really?
They're just the collective market. All the big players, banks, pension funds, insurance companies, foreign governments, big investment funds. When they collectively get worried about the sheer amount of debt being issued, or about the risk that future inflation will erode the value of their bond payments, They react.
They get jittery, as the source said.
Exactly. They start demanding higher interest rates to compensate for that perceived risk. It's a market mechanism for discipline.
And the history here is fascinating. This term, bond vigilantes, it goes back a ways.
It does. Ed Yardeni actually, I think, coined it back in 1983 or 84. And back then, you know what they were worried about? A federal deficit of around $200 billion.
$200 billion. That sounds almost quaint now.
Doesn't it? They saw that $200 billion deficit, freaked out about future inflation, and pushed Treasury yields higher, acting like, as he put it, sheriffs trying to keep the government fiscally honest.
Okay, fast forward to today. What's the deficit now?
Well, the annual deficit is running somewhere closer to $2 trillion, 10 times the level that got the original vigilantes worried.
So if they were powerful then?
The sources are very clear on this. The potential power of the bond market, the vigilantes, is more powerful than ever today because the scale of the borrowing is just so much larger.
And how exactly do these nervous investors actually push rates up high enough to, as one source put it, cause a recession? What's the mechanism?
It's a direct transmission.
Yeah.
Think of U.S. Treasury yields like the rate on the 10-year Treasury bond as the fundamental baseline interest rate for almost everything else in the economy, globally even.
Okay, the benchmark.
Exactly. So when the yield on that 10-year Treasury jumps significantly, say it goes from 2% to 5% because the vigilantes are demanding more, that doesn't just affect the government's borrowing costs.
It affects everyone.
Everyone. Suddenly, the baseline cost for companies borrowing money goes up. Mortgage rates shoot up. Car loans get more expensive. Credit card rates rise.
So it chills economic activity across the board.
Instantly. Companies pull back on investment plans. People can't afford the houses they were looking at. Consumer spending slows down because borrowing costs are higher. It acts like a very powerful brake on the economy.
It's like the market imposing its own monetary tightening, even if the Federal Reserve isn't doing it.
That's a perfect way to describe it. They effectively force the issue. They push rates higher and higher until the economy slows down enough to reduce inflationary pressure, or until the government is forced to signal serious fiscal consolidation. They can literally push the economy into recession if the debt situation looks unsustainable.
Which makes the stakes incredibly high. And this links directly to some really grim long-term forecasts coming out of places like Wharton, right? Tent Smetter's team.
Yeah, the Penn-Wharton budget model. They do really serious work analyzing the long-term fiscal trajectory based on current policies. And their findings are, well, stark.
What do they predict?
Their model suggests that if Congress basically does nothing, if they fail to reach some kind of grand bargain involving both spending cuts and revenue increases to stabilize the debt,
Status quo, basically.
pretty much, then the fixed income markets, the bond markets themselves, are projected to essentially collapse within about 20 years.
Collapse. That
20
sounds extreme.
It does, but it's based on the math. The trajectory of debt growth, driven by entitlements and interest costs, eventually outstrips the economy's ability to service it under current tax law. The numbers just stop working.
And they actually identify what they see as the only mathematical way out if reforms don't happen.
Yes, and this is the really chilling part. The Wharton team states explicitly that, absent major fiscal reform, the only mathematical way the situation resolves itself is through some type of default.
Default. Like the U.S. just stops paying its bills, like Greece or Argentina. That seems unthinkable for the U.S.
Well, we need to be careful with the word default. It's highly, highly unlikely the U.S. would experience a traditional technical default on debt that's issued in U.S. dollars.
Why is that? Why are we different?
Because the U.S. government controls the printing press for its own currency. Unlike Greece, which uses the euro and can't just print more euros, the U.S. Treasury can, in theory, always create the dollars needed to pay any bondholder. If it owes $1 billion, the Fed can essentially create $1 billion.
Okay, so technically the bill always gets paid. You don't default in that sense.
Correct. You don't miss the payment.
But there's always a but, isn't there? What's the catch? If we just put the money, what's the consequence?
The consequence is inflation. Potentially massive runaway inflation. It's sometimes called an inflationary default or a default on the value of the currency.
How does that work?
Think about it. If the government suddenly creates trillions of new dollars to pay its debts, but the amount of actual goods and services in the economy hasn't changed, you just have way more money chasing the same amount of stuff.
Prices go way up.
Exactly. The value of each dollar plummets. So yes, bondholders get their dollars back, but those dollars buy far, far less than they expected. Your savings are wiped out. It's how many countries with debt problems historically ended up coping. They didn't technically default, they just inflated the debt away, making everyone holding the currency poorer, especially their own citizens.
So it's a default through the back door, effectively destroying the currency's value.
That's the risk. That's the non-technical default path the math points towards if we don't change course.
Okay, even setting aside that scary scenario, let's talk about the cost of the debt we already have. Right now, the interest payments. The sources had some truly staggering numbers on this.
Yeah, this is where the problem stops being a 20 years from now issue and becomes an, oh my God, look at this year's budget issue. Because interest rates have already risen sharply.
Thanks to the Fed fighting inflation and those bond vigilantes.
Exactly. The cost to simply service the existing national debt has exploded. The latest projections show the U.S. is expected to spend nearly $1 trillion just on interest payments this year.
$1 trillion. Just interest. Not paying down the debt, just the interest.
Just the interest. It's the most the U.S. has ever spent on interest, by far. Past $900 billion recently, heading towards that trillion mark very quickly.
Just trying to wrap your head around that number. $1 trillion is roughly the size of, what, Australia's entire economy? Spain's economy? Gone. Just on interest.
Pretty much. And the trajectory, according to the CBO, that's the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan scorekeeper.
The gold standard for these projections.
Right. The CBO projects that by next year, 2025, the amount the government spends on net interest costs is going to surpass what it spends on national defense.
Wow. More on interest than the entire military budget.
And it's also projected to surpass spending on Medicare soon after, potentially even Medicaid. It's on track to become one of the single largest items in the entire federal budget.
Just servicing past decisions.
Exactly. And let's quickly clarify that term, net interest costs you mentioned.
Yeah, good point.
Net interest is what the government pays out in interest, minus any interest it receives on assets it holds. The gross interest cost, the actual checks written to bondholders, is even higher. But even this net cost, it's expected to eat up something like 18% of all federal tax revenue this year.
18%? And what was that figure just a couple of years ago?
Back in 2022, it was less than 10%.
So it's nearly doubled in just 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, that rate of increase is it's historically unprecedented outside of maybe wartime. And it's completely unsustainable.
And this huge growing interest payment, it has to come from somewhere. It puts a massive squeeze on everything else in the budget, right?
Absolutely. Think of the federal budget like a pie. The interest payment is a mandatory slice. You have to pay it, otherwise you trigger a global financial crisis. As that slice gets bigger and bigger, every other slice has to get smaller.
So if lawmakers want more money for, say, defense, or building roads and bridges, or funding scientific research, or even enacting future tax cuts,
all of those things get squeezed out, as the source material puts it. There's simply less money available. The interest burden consumes resources that could have been used for productive investments or other priorities. It severely limits fiscal flexibility right when we might need it most.
It's the ultimate deadweight cost, money going out that generates zero future economic benefit.
Precisely.
Now, the U.S. is still seen as the world's safe haven. The dollar is the reserve currency. Why should we really worry that market confidence could evaporate quickly? Isn't the U.S. too big to fail, in a sense?
That's the comforting thought. But we have a very recent, very stark warning sign. The UK mini-budget crisis back in 2022.
Ah, yes, Liz Truss, that was something.
It really was. And it's a critical case study because it shows how fast market confidence can shatter, even for a major developed economy like the UK.
Remind us what happened.
So in September 2022, the new Prime Minister Liz Truss and her Chancellor announced this huge package of unfunded tax cuts, about $45 billion worth. A big fiscal stimulus, but with absolutely no credible plan presented for how they'd pay for it.
And the markets.
The reaction was immediate and brutal. The British pound crashed to a record low against the dollar. But more importantly, investors started dumping UK government bonds. They're called gilts.
They just sold them off fast.
Massively. The sell-off was so fast and so severe that the yield on gilts spiked dramatically. And this caused a secondary crisis because many UK pension funds were using complex strategies involving gilts.
Oh, right, the LDI crisis.
Exactly. The rapid spike in yields triggered margin calls that threatened to make these huge pension funds insolvent. It got so bad the Bank of England had to step in with an emergency bond buying program, basically buying billions in gilts just to stabilize the market and prevent a systemic meltdown of the pension system.
And Liz Truss.
She was out of office within 6 weeks. The market delivered a swift, absolutely brutal judgment on unsustainable fiscal policy.
So the lesson is, Even if the U.S. has the reserve currency advantage, don't test the markets, because their reaction can be incredibly fast and incredibly damaging.
That's exactly the takeaway. When the market decides your numbers don't add up, that your fiscal policy is incredible, it doesn't wait around politely. It acts. And the consequences can be catastrophic.
So, while a full-blown U.S. crisis might still seem low probability to some,
Well, even the big players, like PMCO, one of the world's biggest bond investors, they're not waiting to find out. The sources note they aren't running away from U.S. Treasuries entirely, not yet. But they are changing their strategy.
how so?
They're significantly diversifying.
Right.
And specifically, they're cutting their exposure to long-dated U.S. debt.
Okay, long-dated debt. For our listeners, that means bonds that mature way out in the future, like 10, 20, 30 years from now.
Exactly. So when a huge investor like PMCO starts avoiding those long-term bonds, what are they signaling?
They don't trust the U.S. to get its fiscal house in order over the long haul.
Precisely. It's a profound vote of no confidence in the long-term fiscal stability. They're basically saying, we are not confident that Congress will solve this problem over the next couple of decades. So they're looking elsewhere, finding government bonds from other countries that look, quote, at least as good, fiscally, maybe even better managed.
And the warning is, if the U.S. doesn't start showing credible signs of tackling the debt,
The probability of a UK-style crisis, maybe worse, will steadily go higher with time. The market patience isn't infinite.
let's shift gears a bit now from the pure economics to national security, because this debt problem has huge geopolitical implications. We have to bring up that famous, really startling assessment from Admiral Mike Mullen back when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Yeah, that was back in 2010. Someone asked him what he saw as the single biggest threat to U.S. national security, and everyone expected him to say, terrorism or China or nuclear proliferation.
Right. The usual suspects.
But he didn't. He said the biggest threat was the national debt.
Which must have stunned people coming from the top military guy.
It absolutely did. It was a real paradigm shift. And his reasoning wasn't abstract. It was deeply practical.
What was his logic?
He argued that the growing debt burden, and especially the rising interest payments that would eventually come with it, would inevitably start to squeeze the defense budget.
Competing for the same limited dollars.
Exactly. He foresaw a future where paying interest on past debt would crowd out necessary investments in military readiness, new technologies, and maintaining America's global presence. His fear was simple. Financial weakness eventually leads to military vulnerability.
And looking at the numbers now, his fears were justified.
Completely. As we just discussed, the CBO confirms that this year the U.S. government is set to spend significantly more on net interest payments than on the entire national defense budget. About $93 billion more, according to the latest figures.
We crossed that threshold last year, and the gap is widening.
Right. So think about that from a strategic perspective. When a global superpower is spending more servicing old debt than it is on maintaining its military forces and projecting power, that sends a very clear signal.
A signal of weakness. Or misplaced priorities, at least.
Both. It suggests the country's financial foundations are shaky, and it leaves the superpower potentially vulnerable to a military challenge, as the sources put it. It uses up scarce resources that could be going towards deterring rivals or responding to crises.
And you can bet our rivals are noticing this. The sources mention leaders like Putin in Russia and Xi Jinping in China. How do they view America's debt and deficits?
They absolutely view it as a major vulnerability. The analysis suggests they see our chronic deficits and mounting debt as clear evidence of, quote, potential weakness.
So it feeds their narrative.
Exactly. It feeds directly into their narrative that the U.S. is a superpower in decline, that our democratic system is chaotic and fiscally irresponsible compared to their more centralized models. It's a powerful talking point for them, both domestically and internationally, trying to undermine confidence in American leadership and stability.
There's a certain irony, though, because countries like China, and especially Japan, are actually among the biggest foreign holders of U.S. debt. Let's talk about that leverage. Who owns our debt abroad?
Yeah, it's a complex relationship. Foreign entities hold a massive amount of U.S. treasuries, close to $9 trillion currently, which is near a record high.
Wow. And the biggest holder is?
Japan, by far. They hold well over $1 trillion worth.
Why Japan?
It mostly comes down to trade imbalances. Think about all the cars, electronics, and other goods Japan sells to the U.S. All those dollars flow back to Japanese companies and banks. They need a safe place to park those dollars, and historically the safest, most liquid asset has been U.S. Treasury bonds. So they recycle their trade surpluses back into our debt. It's kind of a symbiotic relationship in a way.
And China. They used to be huge holders, too.
They're still a major holder, but they've been gradually reducing their stash over the past decade or so. That's likely due to a mix of factors, ongoing geopolitical tensions with the U.S., but also a deliberate strategy on their part to diversify their reserves away from the dollar.
So what's the actual threat here? Could these countries, say China, use their massive holdings of our debt as a weapon against us, like in a geopolitical dispute?
That's the theoretical threat, right? The idea that, for instance, if tensions flared over Taiwan, China could suddenly decide to dump hundreds of billions of dollars of treasuries onto the market all at once.
What would that do?
It would cause chaos. It would flood the market, push prices down, and send yields skyrocketing. It would basically trigger that bond vigilante panic effect intentionally, potentially causing a major financial crisis in the U.S.
But how likely is that, really? The experts seem skeptical.
They're generally skeptical, mainly because it would be an act of massive self-harm for China, too. If they dumped treasuries like that, the value of their remaining huge holdings would plummet. They'd inflict enormous losses on themselves.
The financial weapon would backfire.
Pretty much. They'd be shooting themselves in the foot, financially speaking, to make a political point.
Yeah.
So while the theoretical leverage exists, using it as an acute weapon is probably unlikely.
But there's a more subtle impact.
Yes. The more reliant the U.S. is on foreign borrowing and the shakier our fiscal situation looks, the more incentive it gives other countries, not just rivals, but countries in general, like the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, to actively look for alternatives to the U.S. dollar for trade and reserves. It accelerates that slow, long-term erosion of the dollar's dominance.
Okay, beyond markets and geopolitics, there's a really deep moral dimension to this debt issue, the burden on future generations.
Absolutely. This is maybe the most profound long-term risk. For decades, the sort of implicit assumption in economics was that it was okay to borrow from the future.
Why was that okay?
Because the assumption was that future generations would be significantly wealthier than us. Thanks to technology, productivity growth, their standard of living would be higher, so they could more easily afford to pay back the debts we incurred.
That was a deal. Borrow now, they'll be richer later, they can handle it.
That was the deal. But that assumption is now looking incredibly shaky. The sources really highlight the anxiety, particularly among younger generations. Kyla Scanlon, an author mentioned, points out that for millennials and Gen Z, it's now quite clear they don't really know what kind of economic future they're inheriting.
And they face a kind of double whammy, don't they?
A really severe one.
Yeah.
It's like financial oppression by inertia. First, they face the real risk that the major social safety net programs they're paying into now, Social Security, Medicare, maybe even Medicaid, might be significantly scaled back or might not even be there for them in the same form when they retire, simply because the systems become fiscally unsustainable under the weight of the debt.
So the benefits they expect might shrink.
And at the same time, secondly, they're going to be the ones shouldering the tax burden needed to pay the interest on this massive debt that was racked up before they even entered the workforce in many cases.
So they pay more in taxes to service old debt and potentially receive fewer benefits themselves.
Exactly. They're essentially being asked to subsidize the past, a past they didn't create, and from which they might receive diminished returns. It puts a huge potential drag on their future standard of living compared to previous generations. It's a fundamental break in the intergenerational contract.
And that leads to maybe the scariest risk of all, systemically speaking, our ability to handle the next crisis. We got through the 2008 meltdown, we got through COVID, partly by throwing massive amounts of borrowed money at the problem, stimulus checks, bailouts, relief programs.
Yeah, that became the standard playbook, right? Big crisis hits, government steps in with massive fiscal support, runs up the debt, but stabilizes things. And it worked, arguably, in those cases.
Why did it work then, and why might it not work next time?
It worked then because while debt was already kind of high, debt itself wasn't perceived as the core immediate problem. The U.S. still had enough fiscal space, as economists call it. We could borrow relatively cheaply, and there was still huge global appetite for our bonds.
But that's changed now.
That's the critical, terrifying shift the sources are pointing to. The question now is, what happens when the debt itself is the problem? You can't borrow your way out of a debt crisis.
Right. You can't use the disease as the cure.
Precisely. And we know there will be future emergencies. It's guaranteed.
Yeah.
Another pandemic, a major climate-related disaster, a big geopolitical conflict. Something will happen. But if we go into that next crisis already drowning in debt, with interest costs eating the budget.
Our hands are tied. The fiscal firepower just isn't there anymore.
The flexibility is gone.
Yeah.
We've potentially used up our economic dry powder just maintaining the status quo. That's a profoundly dangerous position for a country to be in.
And this all comes back to the ultimate roadblock: politics. Fixing this requires hard choices. Compromise. Budgeting. Things that aren't easy.
They're incredibly hard, especially right now. The sources describe this as a dangerously polarized moment. Getting lawmakers to agree on anything substantial is tough, let alone something as painful as fixing the national debt.
Because the solutions involve things nobody likes. Spending cuts hit specific groups. Tax increases hit everyone.
Right. And lawmakers in both parties, frankly, have gotten very comfortable with the easy things, as one analysis put it. What are the easy things? Cutting taxes, which generally increases the deficit according to most models, and increasing spending, which definitely increases the deficit.
So both sides contribute in different ways, but the result is the same: more debt.
It's become a toxic feedback loop. Tax cuts aren't paid for with spending cuts. Spending increases aren't paid for with tax hikes. It's the worst possible combination for long-term fiscal health, and it just feeds that debt spiral.
And this political paralysis, this inability to compromise even in the face of these dire warnings, it actually led Admiral Mullen to change his mind about the biggest threat.
Yeah, that's striking. Remember, back in 2010, he said the debt was the biggest threat.
Right.
He's updated that view. He now says he no longer sees the debt itself as the single biggest threat. What's replaced it at the top of his list?
What?
The political division in the country.
Wow. So the inability to solve the problem is now seen as a bigger threat than the problem itself.
That's his assessment. Because think about it. The debt, healthcare costs, Social Security solvency, even education, all these huge, critical challenges require bipartisan cooperation. They require compromise. They require people to put the country's long-term health ahead of short-term political wins.
And if that's impossible because the political system is too fractured, too polarized,
Then the problems just fester. The debt keeps growing. The risks mount. The political division effectively guarantees that the debt crisis will worsen until eventually the markets force some kind of brutal reckoning. The politics have become the primary obstacle to survival.
okay, this is heavy stuff. Let's try to bring it back to the listener. But what does this all mean for you, sitting there listening? First, the standard disclaimer.
Yeah.
This is purely educational. We are absolutely not giving financial advice here.
Definitely not. But understanding these big picture macro risks is crucial. It helps you become a more informed citizen, consumer, investor, just better equipped to understand the forces shaping the economy you live and work in.
So, based on all this analysis, what are the possible paths forward? The experts seem to outline a couple of main scenarios for, say, the next 5 to 10 years, maybe 2025 to 2030.
Broadly speaking, yeah, two main paths emerge. Scenario one is basically the blow up, or maybe the muddle through turning into a blow up.
Okay, describe that.
This is essentially the status quo path. Congress fails to make any significant changes, fails to reach a grand bargain. Debt keeps growing exponentially. Interest rates stay high, maybe drift even higher because the bond vigilantes remain nervous and demand those risk premiums. The bond market suffers under the strain,
And the economic outcome.
likely slowing economic growth, maybe even stagnation, combined with stubbornly high inflation, that ugly mix called stagflation. This is the path where the risk of one of those Dalio-style trauma events, a sudden market crisis, keeps increasing over time.
Okay, not great. What's scenario 2?
Scenario two is the political bargain, the Hail Mary, maybe.
Okay.
This is where leaders from both political parties somehow find the will to compromise. They actually sit down and hammer out a credible, long-term plan to stabilize the debt. This would have to involve tough choices on both sides, likely a combination of spending cuts or reforms and revenue increases, meaning higher taxes in some form.
They'd need a multi-trillion-dollar deficit reduction package, realistically.
Absolutely. Something big enough and credible enough to convince the markets that the U.S. is serious about getting its fiscal house in order.
And if I manage that,
Then confidence could return, interest rates might stabilize or even come down, the bond market breathes a sigh of relief, the trajectory bends away from crisis and back towards something sustainable. But as we just discussed, the current political climate makes this scenario look, well, challenging is an understatement. Maybe extremely unlikely right now.
yeah, the political division seems like a massive hurdle for scenario 2.
It's the key variable.
There was a great analogy in the source material about understanding the government's cash flow, its deficits, and how markets react. It involves Mike Tyson.
Yes, I remember that one. It comes from policy analysts who study how financial markets actually react to government budget plans, not just how the economic models say they should react.
What's the analogy?
It's basically,
Yeah.
everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. You, the government, might have your big, beautiful CBO-scored plan for how a new policy will work out over 10 years.
Looks great on paper.
Looks great on paper. But the fixed income market, the bond market, that's Mike Tyson. Your plan might sound good, but if the market doesn't believe it, if it punches your plan in the mouth with higher interest rates or a loss of confidence, your plan is irrelevant.
So the market's reaction is immediate and powerful and doesn't care about your long-term projections if it smells trouble now.
Exactly. And the key insight from that analogy is that markets, especially bond markets under stress, often just break instead of bend.
What does that mean, break instead of bend?
It means they don't adjust smoothly or gradually. When confidence goes, it can go fast. Think about the 2022 UK crisis again. Things seemed fine one day, and literally the next day, the market was in meltdown, requiring emergency intervention. It didn't gently signal its displeasure, it broke.
So failure can be nonlinear, sudden, catastrophic.
Yes, confidence is like oxygen for the economy. Once it's gone, it takes extraordinary measures, often painful ones, like a deep recession or high inflation to restore stability.
Which is why understanding the government's deficit and debt trajectory isn't just academic. It directly impacts the risk environment for your job, your savings, your mortgage, the cost of everything you buy through inflation.
It sets the background music for the entire economy.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. This has been a really deep dive, kind of sobering in many ways, but the core tension seems crystal clear now.
Yeah, I think so. You've got this unsustainable growth in U.S. debt, fueled by decades of policy choices, tax cuts, spending hikes, plus some major emergencies.
And the cost of just servicing that debt is exploding, hitting nearly $1 trillion a year, crowding out other vital spending like defense, maybe even Medicare soon.
Which leaves the U.S. strategically weaker on the world stage and feeds narratives from rivals about American decline.
And perhaps most worryingly, the intense political polarization makes finding a solution, that necessary grand bargain, seem almost impossible right now. The political will just isn't there.
The inability to act has become a primary risk factor itself.
So our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to really mull over after this: are we, the current generation, risking leaving behind a fundamentally weaker, more fragile economy for the next generation?
An economy where the legacy of our high debt severely restricts the government's ability to respond to the next crisis, whatever it may be.
Are we essentially using up the economic tools they will desperately need just to maintain our own political convenience and avoid hard choices today?
If that debt spiral continues unchecked, future generations won't just inherit the debt. They'll inherit the consequences of our failure to act. They'll pay the price for our inability to compromise.
That potential outcome, that intergenerational impact, maybe that's the ultimate reason why this issue demands attention, even if it feels overwhelming.
It's either the catalyst for change or it's the price of inaction. One way or another, the bill comes due.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It was a lot to cover, but hopefully this analysis helps you feel more informed.
Keep asking questions. Keep digging deeper.
Absolutely. Stay financially aware and keep learning.